Welcome to another short interview on responsible sourcing. My name is Patrick Nadal and I'm the Senior Advisor for Exploration and Resource Assessment at EIT Raw Materials, one of the Horizon 2020 Resourcing Projects Consortium members. Today I'm joined by Yulia Polizganova, the Senior Director for Vehicles and E-Mobility Supply Chains at Transport and Environment, an NGO based in Brussels. She's also a board member of the Global Battery Alliance. Welcome, Yulia.
Hi, Patrick. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, and thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. I really appreciate it. Before we go into the questions and hear more about your views on responsible sourcing, can you please briefly introduce Transport and Environment to the viewers?
Yes, absolutely. So Transport and Environment, we are today Europe's largest green transport advocacy and research group. We are based in Europe. Our head office is in Brussels, and we have various offices around Berlin, Paris, etc. We, when it comes specifically to road transport, cars, trucks, etc., we focus on full electrification as the best technology to achieve our climate goals. And within that space, as we electrify the vehicles, we of course also work on more sustainable batteries, responsibly sourced raw materials, etc., to ensure that the supply chain is there for our green ambitions.
Thanks, Yulia. It's great to put things in context. And actually, we will dive into this multi-stakeholder and obviously the responsible sourcing aspects now a bit more. Just the first question from my side. You were a panelist actually at the recent EIT Raw Materials Summit in Brussels just a week ago, in which responsible sourcing obviously was one of the key topics. It was mentioned in pretty much every single panel that we had. What are your personal key takeaway messages from the summit on responsible sourcing?
Well, thanks for this question, Patrick. It's a good question. But if I may, what I actually would say, my takeaway was that you're right that the term was mentioned a lot, but there wasn't an in-depth discussion about how, what does it mean, what shall we do in Europe? The discussion, and rightly so, I understand why, but the discussion focused a lot on how to speed things up, how to accelerate the supply in Europe and abroad, how to fasten permitting, for example, how to ensure local communities are on board. But there wasn't so much of a discussion of what do we need to do in Europe in terms of regulations or innovation, etc., to make sure the supply is more responsible. I actually sometimes feel that we in Europe say that we have better standards than elsewhere without always in detail analyzing, is that so? So when we look at this as TNE, I can maybe briefly tell you, when we look, for example, at social standards, there is no doubt that we have higher social human rights standards than in most countries in the world. But when we look at environmental standards, it really depends. We're doing good on water, on toxicity, for example, but our legislation on waste, on mining waste, is actually below best practice, even in countries like Ecuador or Chile. So actually, a more of an honest discussion about how to ensure sustainable and environmental sourcing of metals would have been my preference. And I hope it's something we can discuss more next year, because today it's been really dominated by geopolitics.
Absolutely. Do you think that's partly a function of the diversity and complexity of Europe being made up of different countries, obviously, with then national regulations? Do you think that plays into that? Whereas other big mining players such as Canada, Australia, China, and Russia, things may run often a bit more smoothly because it's more streamlined, if you want to, say that.
Well, it's definitely one of the answers, right? I think today there's a little bit of a conflict because mining codes are often national, like you say, right? So the actual rules around how exploration licenses, etc., are given is national. However, some cross-cutting environmental legislation is European. So we have a European Mining Waste Directive. We have a European a Water Framework Directive. They're all at European level. What we don't often do is we don't link that overall framework to mining itself and looking whether or not what we have in this cross-cutting legislation, how does it fit the mining sector? Does it need an update, or is it good enough? And I think the conversation today, one of the good things of mining and raw materials being top of the agenda is that we can start having those conversations and looking deeper and analyzing things and updating our legislation as we get more and more experience and projects on the ground in Europe.
That's actually a great segue to my next question. As we know, the raw materials sector is a multi-stakeholder ecosystem. It's very complex, and it is being addressed in many roadmaps and action plans. And we obviously have the recently published Critical Raw Materials Act that acknowledges this aspect and sets ambitious targets for Europe in terms of sourcing raw materials responsibly and sustainably. You already touched on it a bit, but maybe you can elaborate even more. Do you see a good balance here between what the ambition is, and you already mentioned it, the practicality and the inclusive approach? Maybe you already touched on it, as I said, but maybe you can elaborate on one or two specific examples even?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to maybe, the first thing I want really to say is that all of the technologies and practices to make mining less impactful from damage point of view, to make it more environmentally clean, to make it more socially acceptable, have all been invented. We know what technologies to use, how to do it. We know how to integrate communities. It is really about doing this. In my view, the Critical Raw Materials Act actually tries to strike a really important balance between the speed on the one hand and environmental and social safeguards on the other hand. And what the Commission has proposed, it's still a draft, is actually very important to keep. So we say on the one hand that projects have to meet environmental and social requirements to become these strategic projects for Europe. And once they have met the requirements, then they can go a lot faster, right? Permitting, and we can go faster on process. So we can read the papers faster and give okay faster, but we cannot go back on these environmental safeguards. However, if there is still a position to this project, but all the environmental and social requirements are met, the project will go ahead because it is given a status of overriding public interest. And I think this combination, rather complex, but this rather complex compromise combination is really at the heart of this balance between doing things fast, but at the same time doing things right in Europe.
So we do have certainly some very positive actions and some roadmaps lined up. One of the aspects that is often talked about, obviously, in this concept is, or in this context, is the traceability and the supply chain transparency when it comes to responsible sourcing, obviously, because obviously in Europe, we can, in our front yard, so to say, we can ensure that things are done right and according to regulations and high standards, but we all know that only to a certain degree will the raw materials come from inside of Europe. So raw materials will come from other sources outside of Europe, and we need to ensure that it's done responsibly. Do you already see practical solutions out there that, again, that are very fit for purpose and that satisfy not just maybe the industry or not just the NGOs, but something that really strikes a good balance?
What a great question. So if I just take your main question, are there practical solutions? Yes, absolutely. Of course, when I use the word practical, I mean the solutions that work in practice, not the solutions that are cheap to implement. And this is where we have, I think, a disagreement. So the answer to the second question, a solution that today completely unites all the industry and all NGOs, no. Some industry and some NGOs, yes, but the views are divergent. What I am talking about is the concept of due diligence throughout the value chain. You do this with the help of technology. So you would use, for example, blockchain-like technologies, but you also need to have two more things. You need to have actual audits on the ground. So you need to send auditors, for example, to your mine in whatever African, Asian, or South American country. And you, as whoever is the key downstream player, a battery maker, a car maker, a phone maker, that downstream player needs to have a strong relationship and a strong leverage of that supply chain up to the mine. And if these three things are there, so you have the technology, you have the auditing, and you have the strong relationship, you can guarantee that due diligence throughout the value chain. What it means is that you trace risks, not everything. It's not, oh, my pan comes from Ecuador and I'm going to change. No, we know where the risks are. So you pick out those risks, and those risks in the risky countries, you really do due diligence of every step in the value chain, and you check all the environmental and social conditions. We can do this, and it's practical. It's possible to do it. There are sectors where it's being done. What you need is a shift in the mindset of companies to not see transparency and due diligence as a burden, but see it as a condition of doing business in a way that has the social license to operate. Because whether you like it or not you personally, but me, companies, people care where things come from. And the cost of not doing due diligence is a lot higher, because suddenly it transpires you have child labor on your hands, consumers will just turn away. Cancel culture is a real thing in our age. And so it's almost something companies should integrate into their business case as a long-term success factor of their operations.
Right, and we have to admit that the mining sector doesn't have the best reputation. So it should be very high on the agenda. And in this context, I wanted to ask, because this topic is obviously much talked about, the ESG metrics, and even finance institutes have taken that on board and are funding more and more of their funds in projects that they deem to be responsible and sustainable. I say has been talked about a lot. Do you think that this push coming actually from a completely different sector, from the finance sector, can really make a difference for the mining sector and the other stakeholders as well? Is that maybe that kind of momentum that we needed to really push this?
So the push from the finance sector and investors is really welcome, but it will only bring significant change on the ground, not just greenwashing, if we have quite strict standards and methodology on how do we understand ESG. Right? So what is E, environmental practices in mining? Which kind of waste disposal do you have to do? What kind of water treatment is good or bad, right? So deciding on that detail is a precondition for this to be a success. So we very much support mining operations being added to the European taxonomy framework, right? So because once we have that taxonomy framework, it will give that methodology for investors so that the person somewhere in London or Frankfurt or Paris does not need to become a geologist or a mining expert. They can just take off-the-shelf clear standards without reinventing the wheel and apply them. And then it can really have an enormous, meaningful impact. Just look what's happening with coal, right? And how divestments from coal have really shifted, they've created the revolution in the power system. But coal is simple. You don't do coal, you do renewables. With mining operations, there's so many different practices, so you need to get into the detail of it.
Absolutely. And maybe in this context, since we're talking about it, can you maybe share an example? Because I mentioned at the beginning that you're a board member of the Global Battery Alliance. Maybe can you put that into this context, what we just talked about, traceability? I know there's obviously a passport being developed, and maybe can you mention that?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the global projects that the Global Battery Alliance is working on is to create the so-called Global Battery Passport, which would be a mechanism for across the supply chain, from the mine up to the battery, to report. Today, the focus is on greenhouse gases, human rights and child labor, so the social aspects and circularity. But of course, it can be expanded. So to start with these parameters and to report them throughout the value chain, so that a battery maker, for example, in the EU, can take a few producers of cathodes, for example, or other battery components or raw materials between different global countries and compare what has the highest carbon footprint, for example. So this battery passport, to create that transparency throughout the value chain, is very important. What I think is really fantastic about this, so of course there's many passports, right? Many passports, many ideas, but what is different about Global Battery Alliance is, well, first of all, it's global, but second of all, it aims to create this one interoperable digital ecosystem, so that different companies can all communicate in the same language, so that the data can be easily read. And that's the most difficult part at the moment. How do we make sure that Glencore, Huayu Cobalt, for example, and Umicore all communicate in exactly the same standards of data? And I think that if the Global Battery Alliance can crack that would be really a winner globally.
I agree, and yeah, you mentioned data, and that's certainly it sounds very simple often when one talks about it in more abstract ways, but it is really a key, and it is highly complex. So at the beginning, you mentioned that we have the technology and many, if not all, areas to solve these problems, but you now also mentioned that, and I agree, that there is still huge challenge when it comes to data. And you mentioned obviously the Global Battery Alliance in this context. So in terms of responsible sourcing, and coming back to the multi-stakeholder nature of this topic, is that really something where we need more research and development still? Or is it really just about applying what we already know and just get it done?
So within the digital frameworks, the back office end, we still need very much, there is still space for research there. It's not so much research and development, it's more on the deployment side to pilot a few solutions to see what works, right? So piloting is still very much a thing. So on the digital side, still we need research, as I mentioned, and more innovation. However, what I don't think we need is to create new standards or new practices, right? What I meant is the technology, for example, to refine lithium with less CO2 footprint is available. The technology to reduce the toxicity of and safety concerns of mining waste is available. The technology to make sure we don't have dirty water around mining sites is available. The practices on engaging people are all available. So here, in terms of this technologies to lower the impact of actual mining operations, that's available. What is not yet available is all the digital momentum to sharing data. Absolutely. I think we can do this. I think we're doing this, but more piloting and more investment is needed. I honestly would like to stress that it's not so much about research and development. It's about more companies openly coming to the space to pilot solutions, so that the technology providers can experiment, learn, and incorporate that learning. So a little bit of openness about data is necessary to create a joint system.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And yeah, it's a good openness about data. That's certainly something that maybe even is one of those challenges, again, in Europe, because we have different jurisdictions, we have different nations, different languages, and so on, different standards, obviously. So that is certainly a challenge. Maybe one last question from my side. Where do you see, and obviously this in your specific context, in your specific view on things, where do you see Europe in 5 years' time? That standard question in terms of responsible sourcing. Will we have truly achieved something that takes us along the path of the Critical Raw Materials Act? Will we have reached the 10% of raw materials sourced from within Europe? What's your prediction here? Or where do you see still a major bottleneck?
Yes. So I am a permanent optimist. If I wasn't an optimist, I wouldn't work in an NGO, right? So I am an optimist. So if maybe I can say what I would like to see, what I see the potential to do. So one of the success stories Europe can have in raw materials, it's lithium. Lithium generally is abundant, and it means that we can actually be self-sufficient for the most part of our demand, especially because of newer, cleaner ways to refine it, like geothermal lithium. So I hope that in 5 years' time, rather than refining 0% of lithium as it is today, we will be a lot closer to refining 10 or 15% of lithium for our needs. I hope some of these projects, for example, Vulcan in Germany, that there are others, they actually come on board as planned. That is for me really important. What I also hope happens, because this midstream industry can't develop without battery gigafactories. I really hope that the battery industry is strong in Europe, that hopefully we're second to China, that we have this market here which will attract all the investments upstream. So that's more on, the sufficiency side. Then what I really hope, I mentioned waste a lot. I'm really frustrated that we have such outdated waste legislation in Europe. I hope in 5 years' time we would have updated our mining waste law so that we only do dry tailings, dry stacking of waste in Europe. It's just the best way. It's the safest way. Countries like Brazil learned it the bad way. I hope we don't have to have a tragedy to learn how to deal with waste. And finally, on the global dimension, I hope, well, maybe more geopolitically, I hope Europe will be a lot more united and less naive in dealing globally with other countries. At the moment, Germany does their own diplomacy. Olaf Scholz went to Chile. This is great. France does its own thing. But where is Europe in this? Should every country do it on their own, we'll never compete with China or the US. So having a more European approach to this global resources diplomacy and being strategic and quick for me is very important. And then on the sustainability side, I hope we no longer question different standards. We don't create new standards. We all agree that IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, is the best standard, and we apply it globally to all our dealings, for example, with indigenous communities in the developing countries.
Yeah. No, very good points that you raised there. And I want to just, as a last point, maybe hone in on what you just said, that we essentially have the setup. But one thing that I noticed in Europe is that we should speak with one voice rather than individual regions or countries approaching other countries. What I find is that especially outsiders from outside of Europe, perceive the European ecosystem as exceedingly complex and difficult to understand. Do you think we should maybe improve that, also how we're being perceived and maybe how we're set up in terms of the large number of initiatives? Do you think there is? I just would like to hear your opinion on this.
Absolutely. Look, I hope it's possible, because I think if we don't simplify and streamline things in Europe, we will not succeed. US IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is so simple. Any company can understand what this means for them and invest in America. In Europe, you need an army of EU experts to explain IPCEI, InvestEU, REPowerEU, RRF. Even I don't understand all of them. I've been doing this job for 15 years, more or less, in Europe. So I just really think that the Commission, it needs to start internally with the Commission. And it's difficult because it means they have to accept things are not working and change them. And that's not always easy. But they need to completely revamp, especially the funding agenda that they have. Put it all in one fund, make it all simple. All these different pots of money, why do they have to all be, managed in different ways? So that's a big problem for me. That I think that needs to happen. Then when it comes to legislative initiatives, I think it's clear that we have already put in place a lot of laws, the Green Deal, Raw Materials Act, they all need to be implemented. That's a big focus to implement. But I do think that we still should not forget about the gaps, right? So we constantly need to know what's happening. Today, we talked a lot about waste, but actually the more I read about mining, the new kind of agenda is really around biodiversity. Is our biodiversity framework fit for purpose in Europe? I don't know. No one has looked into it for years. We have this Habitats Directive, but when was the last time we reviewed this? So I think we have to constantly innovate and learn. And that's why what is really important is that there's a constant dialogue between civil society globally, policymakers and academics and industry. And as the mining sector today, it's so innovative, lots of things are happening, but there's a constant, feedback loop between everyone, so that regulations are fit for purpose, civil society concerns, if you hear about problems before they actually become a tragedy, you can avoid a lot of things and you can really improve your reputation. So yes, Commission to simplify funding and for all of us to break silos so that regulations are fit for purpose as opposed to no regulations.
Right. Thank you very much, Julia. That was a lot of food for thought. And I just want to highlight that the constant dialogue is probably one of the key things, but also, and that's being stressed now in pretty much every meeting, conference, or workshop we have, the need to act is now very much urgent or beyond urgent. So thank you very much, Julia, for this interview, very insightful views. And yeah, thanks again, and hope to see you soon at another of our events. And yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.